Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Wars Live, where we discuss today's digital revolution by speaking with business executives and thought leaders who are changing how the world lives, works, plays, learns, and dreams. Our guest today is Tony Uphoff, CEO of Thomas, which is a former media company that's now got into the data platform business in the industrial markets and is gathering data insights and a lot of great perspectives on what's happening there. Tony's a regular visitor here on Cloud Wars Live as part of our Digital All-Stars, where Uphoff on industry helps us take a look at what's going on in the industrial sectors in the manufacturing world where technology is meeting these traditional industries. Tony, thanks for being with us. Look forward to another lively conversation today.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Always great to be on the show.
Thanks. So, Tony, we had shared some ideas beforehand. I really like a couple of the things you brought up today. So tell us about that one of the subjects, AI, I've certainly got that you can talk about in the friend or foe context, but what about this other piece that you wanted to talk about? That sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, a couple of things, Bob. So we're monitoring very carefully a trend that is context-aware technology. And it's a fascinating trend, and many of your listeners might be able to relate to this from a previous cycle in technology. And that cycle of technology was when distributed computing started to happen, where, smaller computers would communicate with a larger computer. Over time, we started to figure out how much intelligence you wanted down on the node, the individual client-facing use of that machine, and how much you wanted on a centralized or master computer of some sort. Listeners can easily, think of this as, cloud computing between what might be on your iPhone and what might actually be on the cloud. How do you figure out what intelligence you need at the unit you're holding in your hand versus things that you would have to access the cloud for? And what's happening in the industrial markets is as increasingly contextually aware technology. This could be sensors and other forms of digital technology that are embedded inside of a traditional industrial product or service, is rather than to have to make a call, right, through IoT into a centralized computer, there could be a series of relatively simple behaviors based on the context. Simple example, the temperature goes above a certain level. The sensor is able to take an action at that level without having the latency of having to go all the way through the system and then back, right? Seems kind of simple, but it's a great example of that. The sensor could adapt to time of day. The sensor could adapt to environment, other environmental factors. And so we're seeing more and more interest around this context-aware technology, and the opportunities for this are really remarkable in the industrial marketplaces. So you start to think about, what happens in a warehouse. Seems kind of simple, but inside of a warehouse, you've got all kinds of different things that are happening. You could have sensors that understand how a warehouse worker, how many hours that worker's been on the job, what time of day it is, various things that might indicate the need to either slow a process or stop a process, or to alert based on a process. There's a lot of experimentation around this with people that are working in risk-sensitive areas. Long-haul truck driver would be a great example of this, where there's increasingly contextually aware technology that is helping the driver understand how to regulate and manage. An obvious one would be how many miles or how long between stops or how long between a driver's taking a rest. But now this technology is enabling all kinds of different benefits to not only the driver, but perhaps the operator and owner of a truck or somebody on the receiving end of a shipment.
Yeah. So, Tony, are these being driven by any particular technology companies, or is this just a trend that companies among, on their own right are developing internally?
I think probably a combination of both. What we're seeing is a lot of companies that are, I was going to use the term swarming the IoT marketplace. And so some people are putting this under the rubric of these are classic IoT applications, right? If you wire everything up and you can connect anything to the internet today, as you start to think of the implications in the industrial market for that, then the decision is, hey, maybe there's simple technology we could push down so a binary decision could be made at the point of contact with the technology versus having the latency of it going all the way through the system. So I think there's some of that. I think you're also seeing industrial companies are being innovators in these areas where they're understanding the processes that they're trying to get accomplished. They understand environmental issues like heat or weather or other things that might be really important. Imagine an automated process on a factory floor. Many factory floors today are running multiple shifts through the magic of technology that are very low in terms of the need for lots of people. But what's really critical is if there's not complete supervision of that, if there's any sort of a problem, something overheats or something happens, what you want is that system to be able to shut itself down safely without having to alert somebody who might not be nearby that machine. And you could lose an entire batch of manufactured products or services that were coming out of that machine. And so I think the IoT companies are innovating. I think you got a lot of industrial companies that are innovating with this. I don't know of any singular, and there may be, but I don't know of any singular quote unquote tech company that has become a leader in this. A lot of other people are just putting this also under the rubric of Industry 4.0, right? This amazing intersection that we're seeing, or convergence between a lot of these digital products and services, and then enabling infrastructure like cloud computing and IoT and other things that are enabling these types of applications.
Yeah, and so, Tony, I know you touched on some of them, but if you could just sort of, run down the list. So the advantages are everything from safety to productivity and acceleration of processes, right?
Absolutely. So, one that pops to mind is efficiency. And I don't mean efficiency as in ruthless, you don't need people. I just mean putting value into a system without having to have a tremendous number of people that could be providing value elsewhere, right? If a simple example, would be your phone, you can set an alarm on your phone. That resides on your phone. It doesn't need to call a sophisticated server or anything else on that. And it's something that's a real simple technology and it's embedded in your phone. You can deal with that. Those are the types of things, that's an efficiency play. You don't have to call up and call an answering service anymore. When you check into a hotel, you don't have to call down and say, can you please call me at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning? And they used to have banks of operators that did this. So the efficiency of being able to have systems and technology that can handle relatively simple tasks. That's really what we're talking about. But what is a relatively simple task in this context seems pretty advanced, right? Yeah. Because you're talking about it controlling some fairly sophisticated, perhaps factory automation or robotic system or something, like that. We're also seeing efficiency from another angle. We're seeing a lot of what people are referring to as man plus machine. So if you think about most technology, it really is the idea that it doesn't really replace human beings. What it does is augment what human beings can do. And so over time, we learn new job skills and we adapt to these technologies. I think a lot of these types of contextual technologies will be used in those areas, right? Areas, as I noted before, where there might be risk to a number of hours or perhaps the physical health of somebody that's administrating one of these machines, or an environmental situation where heat may play a role, or there could be some temperature gauge that you need to monitor. And if you're not able to look at it, the temperature could get out of control and ruin a batch, or perhaps be an unsafe area. Those types of technologies where man plus machine, you can automate some of those features in context with the operator of the technology itself or the operator of the machine. And so I think you're going to see a whole host of applications like that. The other aspect about it is, and you and I have talked about this from another angle, the acceleration of learning, right? The amount of time it takes to understand a workflow process and then be able to adapt it. If we put more intelligence in these contextual devices at the point of contact of the application, those devices are going to allow us to become more intelligent faster, so that we can understand and iterate on that. And that data that flows from that is just going to give us insights in real time and just allow us to improve efficiencies, improve safety, perhaps share that data with either product design folks or industrial engineers, who knows, where that data might have applicability. And so that idea of a bit hackneyed, but that learning organization, well, to do that today, you really need real-time data. You can't wait and then sit down every 90 days and, hey, let's look at the factory stats on how much uptime was, or how many injuries did we, avoid. If you're able to see that in real time, it's going to just open up a huge amount of incremental learning.
Yeah, Tony, I don't think that's sort of hackneyed at all. All these different surveys you see today of companies not struggling, but really trying to find the right ways to create those great employee experiences, to have the employees feel more engaged, more in touch with things. And it sounds like that sort of man plus machine loop that you're describing, the individual employees are able then to have more of a sense of what's going on. They can make smarter, better decisions. They can put feedback in, get insights out of it. And it seems like that'll be powerful. I also just wanted to note something when you mentioned, that thing that seems like from another century, but you're at a hotel and you have to call down to the front desk to get a wake-up call. And I think the interim step on the part of the hotels, right, if using technology to solve this, was to put clock radios in everybody's room. They start out pretty basic, and as these things got fancier and fancier, right, you'd have to go through a 2-hour tutorial to learn how to set the alarm on the blankety blank thing, which I remember. And it's a classic technology issue, right? They shovel the technology, make the user work around the complexity, but eventually this stuff gets buried, it gets hidden, and you just get the benefit of it. But in the early days, it can be a little hinky.
Well, and to your point, invariably I'm the one that stays in that hotel room after some joker set it up at 2:30 in the morning and it goes off, and I don't know how to shut it off in the middle of the night, But it is amazing if you think about, there's a good example of contextually aware technology. So how many things do we take for granted, that we should, every room we walk into in a hotel today should be able to adjust for light, should be able to adjust for temperature, should be able to adjust for things that don't require the person in the room to figure out how to use a thermostat for that particular type of room, or to have to adjust things. The same thing with water temperature, the same thing for so many different things. The technologies are available today, but it does require increasingly pushing down, right, at the point of contact. And there's a whole tremendous amount of innovation happening now with companies that are manufacturing smart devices, particularly for use in the hotel industry, where your preferences could be preset. And you can walk into a hotel, and let's say you enjoyed a hotel room that was at a particular temperature that was different than the way I would walk in, no different than, you have preset types of rooms that you want if you're a frequent traveler. Well, having those preferences set makes a lot of sense, right? If you use Uber, what you're finding in Uber today, there's a preference screen that comes up. You can fill out your preferences. So when the driver picks you up, the driver has a set of preferences on, air temperature, on music, whatever the heck that it might be, right? Well, as we get better and better at the use of this technology, why wouldn't that be representative of everywhere we go? I'm a Marriott, elite, members, I'm sure you are too. They know more about me than most places, but every time I check in, I still have to explain, here's, can you do this? Can you do that? Having that profile, and then the technology when you walk into the room, that it can read it from your phone or identify based on the key fob that they give you. That technology is available today, and I think you'll see more and more application of it.
Yeah. Well, the smarter things, smarter people, smarter experiences, better experiences for everybody. So, Tony, it seems like today we got 3 things that you wanted to talk about. So that this context aware, and then really the engine behind that in some ways is, to some extent or another, AI or machine learning. And you have some thoughts about, this really coming to the forefront in the industrial world about AI. So how do you see that? Is it a friend or foe dichotomy now, or is it emerging pretty clearly with the benefits?
Boy, I think that's such a great conversation today, Bob. I really do, because I think it's both. I think it's, what's the old joke about emerging economies? I heard somebody the other day refer to China as an emerging economy, and I said, hey, I think they've emerged. These emerging technologies, artificial intelligence and machine learning, have emerged. They've actually been around for a long time, depending on how broadly you want to define artificial intelligence. But I think what's starting to happen now is we're starting to see levels of scale and speed to artificial intelligence, but we're also starting to see applications that perhaps we hadn't thought of before. And I think that's really, really exciting in many cases, but I also think at the same time, it can be intimidating to a lot of people. And so I think in the pro and con side of this, we spend a lot of time trying to make sure people in our industry understand the power of new technology and how to harness that new technology. And artificial intelligence, I think, has become a little bit of a polarizing issue to a lot of people because they see this as something that potentially could be out of control or dangerous. In some cases, people believe it's taking jobs away. If you go back through history, and I'd put artificial intelligence in a similar continuum, there aren't really too many examples of technology literally putting dozens upon dozens upon dozens of people out of business. It changes jobs. And it does mean that with advanced technology, you are going to see the need to change the way that particular job function works. We've seen it in finance. We've certainly seen it in transportation. We've seen it in so many other industries as technology becomes the centerpiece to how that product or service is produced. And that's been happening in the manufacturing area for 50 years now. US companies have adapted that. I think where artificial intelligence is starting to raise its head is in areas where we can start to take data and learn faster. So we can take data on how different products age, how different products last, how different products interact with other products, and that artificial intelligence can spot that pattern really quickly. Here's a real simple example of that. If you had the right technology inside of let's say it was a building here in New York, we're looking over Hudson Yards. This is one of the largest commercial real estate projects ever built. Well, as those buildings are being designed today, they're using building information modeling so that all the components, the valves, all the different components are modeled out before the building is actually built, including the part numbers and who those were actually ordered from. Well, nowadays, those sensors are hooked up in such a way that device can send a signal, right, before it completely fails, that it's aging. And it'll show exactly where it is, so somebody can go in and replace that. They can even order it from the exact same vendor that they used to, or used initially to be able to find it. But also through artificial intelligence, they can start to spot that pattern and understand how that they could have perhaps a design flaw, or perhaps even you could put 3D printing in proximity to the application of that. So artificial intelligence sees that and actually starts to print the part in proximity where the part could be deployed, right? And that's a good example of, you don't need a human being to do that anymore. You need a human being to administrate that and enable it. But the old days of ripping the wall out to see if we've got a leak or a problem, those days are gone, and artificial intelligence can help us identify those, but also then the learning from that to the next generation of, let's say it's a valve or whatever that part might be. Artificial intelligence can help us find potentially the next generation design of that will be more efficient, that will last longer, that won't fail in the same way.
So Tony, you've mentioned learning as a critical point, both in this theme here about AI, but also in the earlier one with context-aware technology. So clearly it's top of mind for you. What's going on in this world of learning now in the industrial space? And is it a matter of companies just need to do things better, faster, smarter, all of those?
I think it's the last one. I really think it's smarter. I mean, certainly, better, faster, right? Cheaper potentially, always play because technology starts to accelerate innovation. But if you really study companies that understood how to harness the power of technology, particularly the data that comes out of the use of technology, what it allowed them to do was to get smarter. This is man plus machine, right? I don't bother to count on my fingers anymore. I use an adding machine if I need to, or, better yet, a spreadsheet to be able to do that kind of stuff. So what's happening is I can learn faster, I can move quicker. And I think that's what's happening a lot with the machine learning and artificial intelligence is I can apply those technologies to spot patterns far faster, potentially to move around cognitive bias. like all business people, right? We're products of our environment. And I can be absolutely convinced of my point of view because I've been doing this for a long time and I have a really entrenched perspective and I'm an expert in my marketplace, perhaps until I look at contrary data.
Yeah.
And I might look at contrary data and go, whoa, wait a second, something different is happening here. I hearken back to the famous book that many of us responded well to of The Black Swan. And it fundamentally was around this idea of, you know, not being able to challenge your cognitive bias until all of a sudden you were forced to.
Yeah.
And so I do think that the use of data, but particularly being able to speed that use of data up to identify patterns and then act on those patterns, and whether that's artificial intelligence and or machine learning, I believe that's critical today to stay relevant and to keep pace in the markets that you operate in.
Yeah. Tony, could I ask, could you give an estimate on how many times you've heard the phrase the democratization of data?
Oh my God. Could you even count, right?
Right.
You know, and I think, you know, to your point, what's fascinating about what we're describing here, this phenomenon, right? That democratization of data, data is the new oil, all of the cliches. It's interesting when I talk to people, and I think you probably would relate to this. I don't have too many people saying, I don't have enough data.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you and I are trying to define here is the tools that would enable us to see the signal in the noise of the data. Can we spot patterns? Can we see things that are actionable? And I think the newer technologies around artificial intelligence and machine learning can help us in that. And in some cases, we spotted the pattern and we're going to program the algorithm to be able to go after that. But in other cases with machine learning, it can build on the incrementalism, right, of whatever we spotted and learn as it goes down the path. And I think that's critically important because, again, you know, we're at 3 petabytes of buyer behavior data. We've got tons of data and a lot of it's in real time and it's really remarkable. But where we're starting to invest a lot of time and energy and infrastructure for that matter is in identifying major signals, major transitions in that data that we believe would be beneficial for either the development of our business and or the benefit for our users and our customers.
Yeah, and Tony, that's a great point. And I one of the reasons I wanted to push on that a little was, you know, out of those 2 terms or those 2 emerging categories you talked about, AI, context-aware technology, you zeroed in on this notion of learning. So we sometimes, I think, in the tech business or the data business, get hung up on these terms like the democratization of data. You know, we sort of get what the theme is, but that becomes then the overwhelming point. And a lot of people say, I don't know what the hell that means. I'm not really that interested. The point that you're making is, if you're able to do that, if you're able to get more data in the hands of more people and allow them to exploit it or use it or get insights from it in the right way, it actually comes down to things like learning, to safety, to better set of productivity, the more types of customizations that are available today in every business that we're talking about. I had a chat with guys, the senior vice president of global IT for Under Armour, and he said one of the most challenging issues they have today is in manufacturing and the customization. He said, hey, we can knock out the same sort of shoes as fast as anybody, but when you get, you know, millions of people saying, I want that color, I want to design my own color, and then I want to have my own shoelace color, and this on the tread and this on the uppers. So I think that that genie's out of the bottle. It's never going to go back, right? So this notion of learning and understanding, being able to apply that is the future, it seems like, for this digital industrial economy that we're in.
Well, and I think to a certain extent, as I listen to you talk, Bob, you can kind of almost visualize a flywheel effect, right? So when you and I were thinking about interesting topics, the idea of this context-aware technology and then some sort of a series of algorithms or analyses like artificial intelligence or machine learning, but then the flywheel becomes, hey, what are simple systems I can put down at the point of contact with that contextual technology that we don't need to think about?
Yeah.
Let's just build that into the system. So there doesn't have to be a lot of discussion about what does the data show. We already know what the data shows. It's nighttime, shut the lights off, right? So, those are examples where I think that becomes that spectacular flywheel effect where as we identify these patterns in the data, we can then push the intelligence down to the end node of the application of that technology. It doesn't require some, big deep thought of data analytics and data scientists to go through it. We can do that. And then I think also the data coming from that end can also influence areas that maybe we want to see more data on this or see if there's a pattern there that's emerging. The other thing that connects into this, Bob, which to me is endlessly fascinating, is you're also starting to see the phenomenon in a business like ours of what we call digital exhaust, where a lot of byproducts of, and we've talked about this on earlier episodes, a lot of byproducts of data that companies thought was useless. Let's use the metaphor of sitting on the cutting room floor. They're now discovering has some application somewhere. You know what I mean? Data that we just didn't think of. We didn't really pay any attention to. It wasn't core to our business. In the financial markets, they call this alternative data. It's kind of fascinating, I think, as more and more companies start to harness available technology to, in very cost-effective ways, monitor, store, and evaluate that data. They're going to find more and more applications in product design, user features, customer service, other things that maybe they hadn't even begun to think of because they've just been looking at sort of a relatively simple application of data.
Yeah. And, Tony, with that, I think in the overarching theme here in some ways of learning, there's one other point we wanted to talk about a little, right? That Airbus, so right, one of the largest or the second largest aircraft manufacturing company in the world, they're working closely with Microsoft using the HoloLens mixed reality technology here to try to come back to some of those basic things, right? Make more products more quickly, make them at higher quality, but also in here, to come back to your point, they want to do to facilitate training without tying up expensive equipment.
Yep.
So exactly what you're saying, separating in some ways the context of learning from the giant containers or environments we used to have to go through a sort of a real-time, real-world simulation of it. Where do you see this headed?
Well, it's interesting. So I'll come at this from what may seem like an obscure metaphor to use, but you're familiar with the auto racing level called Formula One. It's the most elite form of auto racing. These are basically fighter jets that are on the ground with ground effects, and they campaign all over the world, road courses, and the technology is really remarkable in these automobiles. Starting about a decade ago, what they found was the demographic stretch of the average driver went in both directions. So drivers, well into their 30s were still very competitive, but it got younger and younger and younger and younger until they actually had a 17-year-old who was competing openly for the world championship. And they had year after year for about 3 or 4 years in a row, they had people setting a new record for the youngest world champion. And what they discovered in studying this, and you know where this is going to go, is these young people had grown up driving go-karts, but they had driven these courses many times through simulation. So when they got to Monte Carlo, they had driven it many times before. It wasn't a mystery to them. They had driven it thousands upon thousands of times through simulators. So as that technology is now mainstreaming, and we can apply it in so many different areas, that's a very similar dynamic. We're watching that play out in a variety of different industries. So if I wanted to train somebody to use a very expensive machine called a CNC machining for precision manufacturing, it's not for the faint of heart, right? These are multi-million-dollar machines. There is some level of complexity to running these machines. I'm not going to run a lot of tests through them, right? You really want to make sure you're dealing with that. To actually virtually run one and to run how to deal with something like that is tremendously valuable. Imagine training a new warehouse employee, right? You're in the pick, pack, and ship in any of the big, huge companies that you see out there. Imagine training somebody through virtual reality where they can get a sense for working in the warehouse and interacting with the various machines and physical manifestation before they actually wander on to the floor. I think the training stuff here could be absolutely spectacular. But also I'd go back to the learning from another angle. As we learn how to do that through the virtual machines, and this is that perfect example of man plus machine, we're also going to identify inefficiencies. We're going to identify ways of coordinating workflow and other things through the simulation, if you will, that's going to identify an inefficiency of there's famous stories about Amazon where they've done this, and they've identified putting certain types of products and services together in similar areas. So rather than alphabetized, it's actually organized by the way people order products, and it makes it far more efficient in the way that you pick, pack, and ship these products and services. Well, that was the combination of data, but they also can train a lot of the warehouse staff through the use of virtual technology and understanding how to interact with these physical tools.
Purpose-built.
Exactly.
Tony, I'm sorry, but you were making this very sophisticated point. One of the things that flashed through my head was doing an old-fashioned expense report on paper. Remember, they'd have the column width was defined by the word at the top of the column. So, like reason for travel, you'd have, 5/8 of an inch to try to describe why you did it. But, nobody sat down and meant to do a dumb expense report form or a complicated alphabetized, way of doing these things. It's just we didn't have the tools ready. But here they're coming, and this torrent that's coming in here. Tony, before you go, I wanted to ask you, all the companies that you and your team at Thomas get to talk to and across the different industries, is there, you're talking about some pretty wild new stuff here. Is there a title or a role or responsibility within the company that is sort of taking the lead and driving some of these new approaches?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So we are starting to see a C-level title around technology emerge for some of these manufacturing companies. So it could be a CTO. In many cases, it might be a chief operating officer. So it would be somebody that has a sense of perspective around the physical workflow and what kind of automation and robotics and technologies that are really important. So you're clearly seeing that. We're also starting to see the beginning of people that are coming from a data background. So they may not come out of manufacturing. They may be, I'll use the term data scientist. I can't say that we're seeing that title used a lot in manufacturing, but if you actually talk to these folks and what they do, they're using very sophisticated data analytics to improve workflow. And where we first started to see it, Bob, was around supply chain management, where what we're witnessing in all business, but you can certainly see it very acutely in manufacturing, the industrial markets. You're starting to see the convergence of the physical, the financial, and the digital supply chain, right? So as companies are trying to manage decentralized supply chains, and let's say big customers like a Walmart are increasingly ratcheting down on delivery times and terms and conditions, a lot of companies are realizing the answer to this is technology. Mm-hmm. The answer to understand how to manage this is through being able to analyze their workflow and to either wring some efficiency out and or understand when they need to bring on incremental resources, or perhaps when a particular supply chain is just flat ineffective. It's just not profitable in your line of business. So I think we're seeing a little bit of the CTO phenomenon. I would say in manufacturing, it's less branded by functional title as CTO. I would say that's more probably chief operating officer. We're clearly seeing a rise in what you and I would think of as data analytics. Tell you another role that's incredibly powerful in manufacturing is the role of MRO. So MRO stands for maintenance, repair, and operations. And that is a really powerful position in a lot of manufacturing industries. So these are folks that are, as the title would suggest, that are responsible for the updating, the upgrading, the repair, and the fundamental operations of what's happening on a factory floor. So they're doing everything from kind of evaluating what's the next gen CNC machine, as I used that expression or that term earlier, through to, they're looking at ERP systems that might allow them to interact with, from order into manufacturing to out to the customer. We're seeing some examples where customers are setting up automatic replacement systems with their big customers. so that if I supply to you as a part of the supply chain, it just automatically orders as you draw the supply down. So you don't have to pick up the phone or email me or even connect, and it's a permission-based model. And so we see a lot of folks are setting up those sorts of technologies and intertwined technologies, particularly around this idea of supply chain management. And we think there's going to be a ton of innovation there. It's hard for us to tell yet, but it feels that there's probably a role or two that's emerging, and that's going to be, before we know it, industry standard in manufacturing. Yeah. And I don't know if it's around this idea of data analytics, but it feels to us like more and more companies are trying to figure out how to harness the data or get access to data to make better decisions, around their business.
Yeah, Tony, that as you were describing those remarkable changes taking place right now, I was thinking that I believe that this whole in the technology business, these categories or pillars of the big applications from ERP to CRM to HCM, I think those are become acronyms, right? And they are, from another era. They were from the sort of on-premise, old-fashioned types of how people did stuff. And as you describe things like tie in these sorts of things with an ERP system, it just opens up the door, or supply chain systems, to other things, to the learning that's taking place, to the optimization, to the safety factors. And the digital world is just rendering some of those old, venerable, but I think out of date categories that we had, they just don't work. And one of the things that triggered that thought in my head was your point about, these MRO people it's becoming a more and more important function. But if you think about what they're going to start to do by applying this intelligence that you've described in the learning, it's going to be less about maintenance and instead the prevention, and either replace or repair, or just get those things before they break. So I think it's remarkable to look across the business world and see how these new changes that you've described are forcing us to change not just the language, that's the easy part, but how's the company structured? How do we look at information? How do we set up reports? How do we look at the things that are most important and ensure that these are the sorts of tools and ideas and data that are getting into the hands of the right people, which more and more is everybody in the company.
Yeah, one of the things that we were looking at recently is the redefinition of that role, the MRO, and you just really beautifully articulated it. In a conversation looking at some data, we actually started to use the expression that the maintenance repair instead of operations may become optimization over time. And not to just sound buzzwordy here, but yeah. I think that's what you're describing, that idea of how am I looking at the analytics of my business and optimizing? Could be a new product or service. It could be, I need a new machine or a new capability. But I think it's less about the old kind of grinded out operation stuff and much more about making really intelligent decisions. And something you and I have talked about before, I think that shift from on-premise to cloud-based applications is starting to enable more intelligence in the software. So if you go back to where we started of contextual technology, we just changed out the financial system at this company from a legacy provider on-premise to a cloud-based provider. But there's so many tools as we get into this that are opened up. And you can think of this as artificial intelligence, but the ability that the system can see all the data in there and start to set up either templates or guides or recommendations, because it's just numbers. It's looking at patterns in the numbers. The old on-premise software model didn't really allow for that. And it's funny, in the sweep of history, to talk about software as old. But the shift here where we're putting more intelligence, and now we can set up those contextually relevant technologies in the software to start to adapt to things. Business dynamics, it can see when your fiscal year is, it can set reminders, it can do all kinds of different things today. Imagine that applied to the factory floor as well, where these systems can start to recommend improvements in supply chain. A lot of companies struggle when your supply chain starts to move farther out. Let's call it decentralized supply chain. How do you figure out, as you get farther and farther out, what's my real margin on this? Am I making a profit on the fourth level of my supply chain, right? Well, we've now got tools and systems that could simply make that decision for you. You may not
Yeah.
act on it,
Yeah.
but the intelligence is in that software now. And we have the ability to run our businesses based on that kind of incremental intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tony, one of the other things that leads to here, just back to that Airbus thing for a second, is that Airbus has announced that it has built off-the-shelf solutions for its customers so they can benefit from the company's mixed reality expertise. So you get a giant company like Airbus using it, they master that, all those different advantages and advances that you've described, then they put those forward, and instead of it just becoming an internal capability, it becomes a new source of revenue for them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we were talking earlier about, properly used, a lot of these more advanced technologies are going to create new products.
Yeah.
Or new services, right? And you're going to find examples like that. It's dated to say the least, but if you go way back in the aerospace industry, the Sabre system and some real advances, were developed by a singular airline, in this case, American Airlines, that became ubiquitous in the marketplace because the application transcended an individual company's use of it. This could be another example that we're watching where, a company like Airbus realizes, hey, there's a whole business here. And whether they define themselves as the ultimate best owner of something like that, or they unleash the technology or license it to others, I think it's a spectacular example of innovation that certainly transcends a singular company's use of it.
Yeah, yeah, and Tony, you're right. And more and more companies these days want from the people they're buying from, they don't just want what they're selling. They want, I don't want just what you're selling. I want what you know.
Yeah.
I want the expertise there. So speaking of what you know, as always, great conversation here. How could people find out a little bit more about your company and what you have to offer?
Hey, thanks, Bob. So you can visit www.thomasnet.com, and it is our major sourcing platform. Every 2 seconds, an engineer, procurement professional, or one of these MROs is sourcing a product or a supplier on thomasnet.com, and that's how we generate all the data that we oftentimes talk about on your show. And we also have a daily email newsletter that is called Thomas Industry Update, and it is a free newsletter, but it's a fantastic glimpse into the industrial economy and covers many of the subjects that you and I have touched on. As a matter of fact, Bob, as I sent to you earlier today, we have a fantastic feature today on ContextAware Technology. It was why it was uppermost in my mind. And that's a complimentary email newsletter that people can subscribe to that as well.
I've applied for that newsletter a couple of times. I keep getting rejected as it said unfit character. What does that mean?
Moral turpitude, Bob. We do have an artificial intelligence engine.
Tony, thanks. This has really been terrific. As always, really enjoy your ideas and perspectives into a part of the world that might be changing faster than any other part of this remarkable digital economy.
Always fun, Bob. Thanks again. Look forward to chatting next month.
Very good, Tony. Thanks a lot. Uphoff on Industry, and thanks to all of you folks for spending time with us. Share your feedback with me, Bob Evans, at bobevanspa@gmail.com. Thanks a lot, and we look forward to seeing you next time.